Have you ever done a load of white laundry and something dark accidentally got mixed in? A single red item somehow went unnoticed, and when you open the washing machine, you discover that everything has been turned pink. It's amazing how one small, unnoticed item can give you a whole new wardrobe. Jesus says that the kingdom, God's coming rule, is a little like that. Jesus speaks of yeast and mustard seeds, and not red socks. But the idea is much the same. Mustard plants were not really grown as a crop in Palestine at that time, though the tiny seeds could easily get mixed in with the grain a farmer sowed. The minuscule dust-like seeds were easily missed amidst the grain, and only later, when a fast-growing mustard plant began transforming the field, did the farmer realized what was going on. And the yeast in the parable is not the powdered stuff we buy in packets for baking. This leaven is dough that has begun to sour, to go bad. Bread makers know it as starter. It is kneaded into the new dough to make it rise during baking. In the Bible, leaven is almost always a symbol of corruption. Leavened bread could never be used in an offering made to God. At Passover, not only was leavened bread forbidden, but not even a trace of leaven was allowed to be found in people's homes. And even Jesus speaks of the teachings of the Pharisees as leaven that corrupts and distorts the good gift of God's law. Jesus says the kingdom that has come near, God's hoped for new day, is like a mustard seed that unexpectedly takes over the farmer's field, like leaven that turns the bread into something unfit to offer to God, like red socks that turn white dress shirts pink. Now, perhaps it's a little unnerving to hear about the kingdom, God's hope for a new day, as something that subverts and corrupts, especially for us Presbyterians who love everything decently and in order. Yet Jesus says the kingdom that has come near in him is like that. An unnoticed, barely perceptible presence that changes things in unnoticed ways. Jesus continues his surprising imagery as he speaks of the great worth of the kingdom. Merchants like those that find the pearl in the parable were the used car salesmen of Jesus' day. And the fellow who finds a treasure in someone else's field, well, he commits either theft or fraud in order to acquire it. I suppose that Jesus is saying something about how desirable the kingdom is, so desirable that we should risk almost anything in order to be a part of it. Jesus says that the kingdom that draws near in him, God's rule that draws near in him, is something that subverts and corrupts how things are, surprisingly aligning itself with the poor and the weak and the outcast and the despised, those who are on top of things, the rich and the powerful, the caretakers of religious institutions. To them, this may indeed seem like a corrupting influence that needs to be wiped out. Killing Jesus was supposed to stop it. But Easter morning declares that the threat of the kingdom, the subverting work of the kingdom, is very much alive. Unfortunately, the church has very often marginalized the kingdom. Over the centuries, the radical Jesus movement gradually evolved into a religion, not so different from many other religions. The focus shifted to rules about belonging and correct beliefs. In turn, those became requisites for getting into heaven when you die. In more modern times, as societies became more individualistic, faith became a very personal thing that saved you. And to varying degrees in different denominations, the notion of the kingdom at work to change the world got paid a little more than lip service, or was forgotten entirely. Back in the 1980s, our denomination officially declared a peacemaking ministry. We said that peacemaking was the calling of every believer, and that churches, congregations were urged to integrate peacemaking into their ministry. The General Assembly created the annual peacemaking offering. Resources were developed to study and discuss peacemaking, including a pledge that church sessions could adopt and sign to say that they were a peacemaking congregation. Many presbyteries encouraged their congregations to sign this commitment to peacemaking. And often they would publicly announce the percentage of churches that had signed on. Now, peacemaking seems like a no-brainer. Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." But in fact, peacemaking turned out to be a contentious issue. In the 1980s, the shadow of the Vietnam War loomed large, and some associated peacemaking with the anti-war demonstrations. Many sessions refused to sign the commitment. The first church I served was one of them. They worried that it aligned them against the military, against U.S. defense policy. And after all, wasn't Christian faith about personal salvation, not politics? Yet when Jesus begins his ministry, his very first words are about the kingdom, God's new governance that has come near. Jesus uses a political image to speak of God's coming new day. And he says that we need to change, to repent, to begin living in new ways now. Now, we Americans don't have a lot of familiarity with kingdoms and kings. Although we are sometimes fascinated with the British royalty, we typically know them as mere figureheads. But Jesus speaks his words into a world where kings made the rules. To speak of God's kingdom is to say God rules. God is the central character in the world. God is the one shaping history. God is at work in surprising, subversive, unnoticed ways to bend history, to bend the world to God's purposes. But the world, and many of us, do not believe it. It turns out it's pretty easy to believe in God without believing that God rules, that God is in charge. It's easy to live our lives believing in God, but our day-to-day ruled more by economics, political ideologies, our desires for success, than by the ways of God. We may say that God rules, but very often there's little evidence of it in our lives. Not Jesus. Jesus is so absolutely certain of God's rule, his life so saturated with God's rule, that he can do nothing other than to live it out, to align himself with the ways of the kingdom, with the poor and the outcast and the sinners, with those that the people of power do not expect. Jesus is so certain of the kingdom, so sure that God rules, that God's will and not that of us or a political party or anything else will be done, that he's willing to give his life for it. What an absurd idea to believe that God, not military power, economic power, is really in charge. What a foolish notion to think that God is at work in unexpected ways to ensure that God's will, not ours, or a government's, or anything else's, will finally be done. What an idealistic illusion to think that we as the church could together live in ways that show this strange kingdom to the world. When I graduated from seminary, a favorite professor of mine gave me a gift, a little book by Walter Rauschenbusch entitled Dare We Be Christians? It was written in 1914, at a time when the American Christianity was brimming with confidence. But Rauschenbusch had done a lot of work in destitute parts of New York City. And he thought that the church's focus on personal salvation had lost sight of Jesus' teachings about the kingdom and his call for us to be a part of it. And he asked if we dare live into that call, if we dare trust in the power of the kingdom that Jesus says has drawn near in him, if we dare live in ways that transform others and even transform the world. Dare we? Dare we trust that the power of resurrection has been set loose in the world? Dare we trust that God rules? That God is shaping and bending history to God's purposes in ways that the world often does not notice? Dare we become agents of God's coming rule, the kingdom? Yeast, mustard seeds, red socks, citizens of God's coming new day. All praise and glory to the God who comes to us in Jesus, and who in Jesus brings God's rule near and invites us to become part of it. Thanks be to God.